Welcome to Stories Mystics. Unravel secrets in the snow, solve crimes by candlelight, and step into worlds where every shadow hides a story. Today's story is Miss Marple and the Winter Snow Slaughter. A postman lies dead in perfect snow, no footprints but his own. A single scarlet thread leads to a frozen murder weapon, and a village full of liars. Can Miss Marple catch a killer who weaponizes winter itself? Chapter 1 drops now. Subscribe for weekly mysteries, chilling twists, and stories that keep you up past midnight. Hit subscribe. The next clue is waiting. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The crimson stain on fresh powder. The first snow of December had fallen like a secret whispered across the Cotswolds, thick, deliberate, and mercilessly silent. It draped the village of St. Mary's Mead in a hush so complete that even the rooks in the churchyard seemed to speak in lowered voices. By the time the 9:17 from Paddington wheezed into the little platform, the drifts had already climbed the station master's boots to the laces. Miss Jane Marple stepped down from the carriage with the unhurried grace of a woman who had never once hurried in her life, yet somehow arrived precisely when she intended. Her nephew Raymond had promised a quiet Christmas. No murders, no mysteries, only mince pies and the gentle tyranny of his wife Joan's newfangled vegetarian recipes. Miss Marple had smiled at the letter, folded it into her reticule, and packed 3 extra skeins of wool. One never knew when a long winter evening might require a complicated cable pattern or an alibi. The village lay half a mile beyond the station, past the frozen duck pond and the crooked finger of the war memorial. Miss Marple walked alone. The porter was busy wrestling a crate of tinned salmon, and the only taxi, an ancient Morris with a cough like a consumptive walrus, had been commandeered by the district nurse. Her boots left neat, oval prints in the virgin snow, each one filling slowly behind her as though the ground itself were reluctant to let her pass. She had just reached the lich gate of St. Mary's Church when the scream came. Not the theatrical shriek of a heroine in a penny dreadful, but a raw, animal sound that tore the morning open like a knife through silk. It issued from the far side of the churchyard, where the yews leaned together in conspiratorial clusters. Miss Marple did not run. Running was for younger knees and larger dramas. Instead, she lifted her skirts an inch clear of the snow and proceeded at a brisk, dignified glide that would have done credit to a swan with places to be. The scream belonged to Mr. Puckle, the verger, who stood knee-deep in a drift, one mittened hand clapped to his mouth as though to cage any further outbursts. His other arm pointed, rigid as a signpost, toward the base of the ancient yew that marked the boundary between consecrated ground and the wilder meadows beyond. There lay the postman, Reginald Bunting, 38 years old, father of 4, notorious for delivering the parish magazine 2 days late and whistling Greensleeves off-key, sprawled face down in the snow as though he had decided to measure its depth with his forehead. His red Royal Mail cap had rolled a polite distance away, coming to rest against a headstone like a misplaced communion wafer. From the neat, dark hole just above his right ear, a ribbon of blood had seeped into the snow, freezing mid-trickle into a delicate filigree of scarlet crystals. It looked, Miss Marple thought with the detached precision of the habitual knitter, exactly like the lace edging on Mrs. Bantry's best tablecloth. Around the body, the snow was a chaos of footprints, Bunting's own, broad and splayed from the weight of his mailbag. A second set, narrower, heeled, coming from the direction of the vestry door, And then, most curiously, nothing. No trail leading away. The narrow prints terminated in a perfect circle of trampled snow, no wider than a dinner plate, as though their owner had danced a solitary jig and then ascended bodily to heaven. Or descended, Miss Marple amended silently, noting the faint scorch mark at the circle's centre, a coin-sized blister where something had burned hot enough to melt snow to steam. Mr. Puckle found his voice. He's gone, Miss Marple, dead as mutton. I only stepped out to fetch the hymn-boards, and his Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in a storm. There's no one here, no one. Miss Marple knelt, careful of her skirt, and touched 2 fingers to the postman's neck. The skin was already cooling, though not yet rigid. Death had occurred within the hour. She noted the angle of the wound, the absence of powder burns, the way the blood had flowed outward rather than upward. A small caliber bullet, fired from perhaps 6 feet away. The killer had stood on the vestry path, raised the pistol, and she straightened, brushing snow from her gloves. Fetch Dr. Haydock, Mr. Puckle, and Constable Polk. Tell them to bring a tarpaulin. We mustn't let the evidence melt. The verger stumbled off, boots crunching. Miss Marple remained studying the circle of trampled snow. She took from her reticule a silver propelling pencil and a scrap of paper, originally intended for a grocery list, and sketched the pattern quickly. The overlapping boot prints, the scorch mark, the precise radius. Then, because one never knew, she measured the distance from the circle to Bunting's body with the span of her umbrella, exactly 7 feet, 2 inches. A gust of wind rattled the yew branches overhead, dislodging a miniature avalanche that pattered onto the corpse's shoulders like apologetic confetti. Miss Marple looked up. The lowest branch hung 8 feet above the ground, too high for a man to have swung from, even if he'd been an acrobat. And yet, she circled the tree, eyes sharp. There, half buried in a drift, lay Bunting's mailbag. The flap hung open. Letters had spilled like white petals. One envelope, thicker than the rest, had landed face up. It was addressed in violet ink to Miss Lavinia Pinkerton, the old manor house, and sealed with crimson wax impressed by a signet ring. A tiny, perfect fox. Miss Marple's lips pursed. Lavinia Pinkerton had died in April. Peacefully, they said, though the village had buzzed for weeks about the nephew who'd inherited everything and the companion who'd inherited nothing. The letter then was either very late or very deliberate. Footsteps crunched behind her. Constable Polk arrived breathless, helmet askew, mustache bristling with frost. Dr. Haydock followed, medical bag swinging like a pendulum. The constable took one look at the body and turned the colour of uncooked sweet. "Morning, Miss Marple," he managed. "Bit of a nasty business." "Indeed," she replied, though I suspect Mr. Bunting would phrase it rather more strongly. Dr. Haydock knelt, examined the wound, and gave a low whistle. .22 caliber, I'd say. Clean entry, no exit. Death instantaneous. He glanced at the circle of footprints. Odd, though. Looks like the shooter danced a jig and vanished. Or was lifted, Miss Marple murmured. The constable snorted. Lifted. By a passing angel, maybe. Or a rope, she said mildly, though angels are less likely to leave scorch marks. Polk opened his mouth, closed it, then opened it again. Rope? Miss Marple pointed with her umbrella. High in the yew, almost invisible against the dark needles, a thin black cord dangled, its end frayed and singed. It had been cut or burned through. Dr. Haydock followed her gaze. Well, I'll be hanged. Someone hoisted the shooter up into the branches, then lowered him down again after the deed, like a stage trick. "Precisely," said Miss Marple, "though I suspect our magician is more accustomed to village pantomimes than Drury Lane." Constable Polk scratched his head. "But why? Why go to all that trouble?" Miss Marple bent to retrieve the violet envelope, careful not to disturb the other letters. "Because, Constable, someone wished to deliver a message along with the bullet. And messages, as we know, are Mr. Bunting's specialty." She slipped the envelope into her pocket just as the church clock struck 10. Somewhere in the distance, a sleigh bell jingled, once, twice, then fell silent. The snow had begun to fall again, soft and deliberate, already smoothing the edges of the footprints, the scorch mark, the blood. By noon, the churchyard would be a blank page. Miss Marple turned up her collar. "Come, gentlemen. The tea room will be opening. Mrs. Price bakes an excellent scone, and gossip, like evidence, is best served warm." As they trudged back toward the lich gate, she glanced once more at the yew. The black cord swayed gently, a pendulum counting down to the next act. Somewhere in the village, a killer was wiping gun oil from his fingers and rehearsing an alibi. Somewhere else, a woman who ought to be 6 months in her grave was about to receive a letter that would change everything. Miss Marple smiled to herself, a small cat-like curve of the lips. Christmas, she reflected, was always a season of surprises. Chapter 2, Tea, Tittle-Tattle, and a Telltale Icicle. The copper kettle tea room smelled of cinnamon and conspiracy. A coal fire snapped in the grate, throwing amber reflections across the low beams where dried hops hung like golden nooses. Mrs. Price had wedged a sprig of mistletoe above the till. It drooped, half frozen, as though even the plant had second thoughts about encouraging kisses in a village suddenly short one postman. Miss Marple chose the corner table beneath the dartboard, out of the draught, within earshot of every tongue. She laid her gloves beside the teapot with the precision of a card sharp, arranging a hand, then signalled for a single scone. Constable Polk, still pink about the ears, hovered by the door until Mrs. Price shooed him to a stool with the promise of a free Eccles cake. Dr. Haydock had gone to telephone the coroner. The village, meanwhile, had come to tea. They arrived in flurries of snow and speculation. First came Miss Hartnell, the district nurse, cheeks whipped scarlet by the wind, her starched cap askew like a listing ship. She was followed by Mr. Clement, the vicar, wringing his hands as though trying to squeeze sermons from his cuffs. Mrs. Lestrange, tall, enigmatic, newly arrived from the continent, glided in last, trailing a scent of verbena and something sharper, metallic. She took the window table alone, arranging her furs so that only her eyes showed, green and unblinking as a cat's. Conversation began in murmurs, rose to a rustle, then cracked wide open when Miss Hartnell slapped the morning's Western Gazette onto the tablecloth. The headline screamed in Gothic type, "Postman slain in churchyard horror." Beneath it, a grainy photograph showed Constable Polk attempting to look authoritative while snow slid off his helmet. "Shot through the brain like a rabbit," Miss Hartnell announced, "and not a footprint to show for it. Mark my words, we've a ghost with a grudge." "Ghosts don't use .22 ammunition," said Mr. Clement mildly, "though I grant you the footprints are perplexing." Mrs. Price bustled over with a tray of rock cakes hard enough to concuss. "Perplexing? The man was murdered in broad daylight. My Bert says it's poachers gone mad on elderberry wine." "Your Bert says a lot of things after 3 pints," Miss Hartnell retorted. "What about that rope Miss Marple found? Sounds like circus folk to me, or foreigners. Her gaze flicked to Mrs. Lestrange, who merely lifted an eyebrow and continued buttering a scone with surgical delicacy. Miss Marple poured tea, the steam curling like incense. She had slipped the violet envelope beneath her saucer. Its wax seal gleamed like a drop of fresh blood. Poachers rarely waste bullets on postmen, she observed, and circus acrobats seldom choose yew trees for their high-wire acts. No, the rope was a makeshift pulley, clever but improvised. Our killer is resourceful, not rehearsed. The bell above the door jingled again. This time it admitted young Mr. Archer, the solicitor's clerk, spectacles fogged and scarf askew. He carried a leather dispatch case monogrammed with the same fox that sealed the mysterious letter. His eyes darted around the room, alighting on Miss Marple with the desperation of a drowning man spotting driftwood. Miss Marple, thank heaven. Mr. Sims sent me. He's tied up with the inquest, but there's the matter of Miss Pinkerton's estate. The will's gone missing from the office safe, and now this. He gestured vaguely toward the window, where snow had begun to blur the church spire into a ghost of itself. Mrs. Lestrange set down her knife. Lavinia Pinkerton's will, but she died in April. Everything passed to her nephew, Captain Wainwright, did it not? Archer flushed. In theory, but the captain's abroad, India, last we heard, and the companion, Miss Blacklock, has been making noises about undue influence without the original document. He trailed off, mopping his brow with a handkerchief that smelled faintly of camphor. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked once, twice. Curious. Mr. Bunting delivered a letter addressed to the late Miss Pinkerton not 3 hours ago, sealed with a fox postmarked yesterday. Someone, it seems, believes her very much alive, or wishes others to. A collective intake of breath rippled the tablecloths. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the window panes like impatient fingers. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the largest icicle above the door sheared clean from the eaves and speared through the glass in a glittering arc. It struck the table beside Mrs. Lestrange, exploded into shards, and, impossibly, revealed a frozen scrap of scarlet wool embedded in its heart, the exact shade of the postman's missing scarf. For a moment, no one moved. The icicle's remnants hissed where they met the hot teapot, sending up a ribbon of steam that smelled faintly of lanolin and gun oil. Mrs. Lestrange was the first to recover. She lifted the scarlet fragment between thumb and forefinger, turning it so the light caught the tiny, deliberate tear at one end. Someone, she said softly, has been weaving evidence into the weather itself. Miss Marple took the wool, holding it to the firelight. The fibres were coarse, hand-spun, dyed with madder root, nothing a postman could afford on his wages. She sniffed delicately. Beneath the sheep smell lay a trace of turpentine, the sort used by artists, or by those who cleaned brushes after painting forgery. Constable Pork lumbered over, crumbs on his moustache. Now then, what's all this? A calling card, Miss Marple replied, delivered by the elements. Our killer is impatient or theatrical, perhaps both. Miss Hartnell leaned forward, voice dropping to a thrilled whisper. You don't think it's the companion? Miss Blacklock was always sketching in the garden, and she had access to the manor's attic, ropes, pulleys, all that theatrical nonsense from the old amateur dramatics. Or the captain, Mr. Clement countered, returned in secret, desperate to secure his inheritance before the companion contested. Mrs. Lestrange smiled, a slow, feline curve. Or someone who benefits from chaos, a third party stirring the pot while the airs squabble. The tea-room door burst open again, admitting a gust of snow and Mr. Puckle, wild-eyed and clutching a brass candlestick. Vestry's been ransacked, hymnals tossed like confetti, collection plate melted in the stove, and this. He thrust the candlestick forward. Its base was wrapped in the missing length of the postman's scarf, the ends knotted tight around a single brass bullet casing, still warm. Silence fell, thick as clotted cream. Outside, the church bell began to toll the hour, 11 slow, deliberate strokes. On the final note, the lights flickered. The fire gave a sullen pop, and for an instant the tea-room plunged into shadow. When the bulbs steadied, Mrs. Lestrange's seat was empty. Only her furs remained draped across the chair like a shed skin, and on the tablecloth beneath them lay a single playing card, the Queen of Spades, her face scratched out with a hatpin. Miss Marple turned the card over. On the back, in the same violet ink as the mysterious letter, someone had written, "The fox hunts at midnight. Bring the will." She tucked the card into her reticule beside the envelope, then rose. "Mrs. Price, might I trouble you for a doggy bag? I believe the evidence is about to take a walk." As the patrons erupted into fresh babble, Miss Marple stepped into the snow. The footprints leading from the tea-room door were already filling, but she could see the direction, toward the manor where the icicles hung like daggers and the attics waited, full of ghosts and pulleys and secrets sharp enough to cut throat or reputation. Behind her, the tea-room windows glowed amber against the storm. Ahead, the village lay hushed, waiting for the next act. Miss Marple pulled her scarf, a sensible grey wool, hand-knitted in a pattern of interlocking foxes, tighter around her throat, and followed the footprints before the snow could swallow them whole. Somewhere in the distance a sleigh bell jingled again, closer now, and beneath its music she thought she heard the faint, rhythmic creak of rope on wood. Chapter 3. The Midnight Sleigh and the Silent Bell. The snow had turned traitor. What began as soft persuasion now drove sideways in needles of ice, hissing against the lantern Miss Marple carried like a conspirator's signal. She had left the copper kettle with the verger's candlestick wrapped in brown paper beneath her arm and the Queen of Spades tucked inside her hymnal. The footprints she followed, Mrs. Lestrange's elegant, narrow boot heels, had already begun to crumble at the edges, as though the storm itself were an accomplice paid to forget. The trail led past the war memorial, where the bronze soldier's bayonet dripped icicles like frozen tears, and on toward the pine copse that ringed the village like a dark ruff. There the prince vanished entirely, swallowed by a confusion of sleigh runners, twin parallel scars wide as a pony's stride, cutting clean through the drifts and disappearing between the trees. The runners were fresh. Frost had not yet feathered their edges. Whoever drove the sleigh had passed within the last quarter hour. Miss Marple hesitated only long enough to draw a silk scarf across her mouth against the wind. Then she stepped into the forest. Pines closed overhead, their branches interlaced so tightly that the snow fell in slow, deliberate clots rather than flakes. The lantern threw a coin of gold ahead of her. Beyond it, darkness pooled thick as ink. Somewhere in that darkness the sleigh bells had fallen silent, but the runner's track glowed faintly, phosphorescent with reflected starlight. She followed, one gloved hand brushing trunks for balance, the other clutching the candlestick like a talisman. After 10 minutes the trees thinned. The runners curved sharply left, descending a slope toward the frozen mere that locals called Blackwater Pool. On its nearer bank stood a squat stone building, half swallowed by ivy. The old ice house, abandoned since the manor installed electric refrigeration in 1923. Its padlock hung open, the hasp bright where metal had scraped metal. Miss Marple extinguished her lantern. The moon, riding high and merciless, turned the snow to mercury. She crept forward, boots silent on the packed path, and eased the ice house door ajar. Cold breathed out at her, ancient, fish-sweet, laced with coal smoke. Inside, a single hurricane lamp burned on an upturned crate, its flame guttering in a draught. The sleigh stood in the center of the earthen floor, a low, black lacquered affair with crimson cushions and brass fittings polished to a wicked gleam. The pony, small, piebald, eyes rolling white, was still harnessed, breath pluming in frantic clouds. Someone had thrown a horse blanket over its flanks, but the creature trembled as though it had been driven hard and fast. Beneath the sleigh lay a scatter of objects. A woman's kid glove stained with what might have been blood or ink, a brass telescope dented at one end, a ledger bound in green leather, its pages swollen with damp, and, half buried in sawdust, the postman's missing scarf, now whole, the torn fragment from the icicle rejoined with clumsy darning stitches. Miss Marple knelt. The ledger's cover bore the embossed crest of the Pinkerton estate, a fox couchant beneath a crescent moon. She opened it carefully. The entries were in two hands, one spidery and precise, the other bold, almost violent. The final page, dated yesterday, read, "Delivered to LP as instructed. Captain W. insists silence. Payment in full upon destruction of original will. Refuse and the village learns what became of the real heiress." Below, a single line in the spidery hand. "Fox hunts tonight. Midnight. Ice house." A floorboard creaked overhead. Miss Marple closed the ledger and slid it beneath the horse blanket. She had just straightened when the trapdoor in the ceiling banged open and a rope ladder uncoiled like a serpent. Boots appeared, men's boots, caked with sawdust and something darker, followed by the bulk of Mr. Sims, the solicitor, his usual pomposity deflated by cold and fear. His tie was askew, his bald pate glistening with meltwater. "Miss Marple," he wheezed. "Thank God. I thought I heard the pony and feared poachers, or worse." His gaze darted to the sleigh, the ledger's corner now hidden. "You shouldn't be here. Dangerous. The ice." He broke off as a second figure descended. Mrs. Lestrange, furs discarded, clad in a man's black coat and breeches. Her hair, released from its pins, fell in a pale torrent to her waist. In her right hand she carried a small, nickel-plated pistol. In her left, the original Pinkerton will, its red seal broken. "Too late, Mr. Sims," she said. Her voice was low, almost amused. "The fox has already sprung the trap." Sims took a stumbling step back. "You said the captain would handle everything. You promised." "I promised results," Mrs. Lestrange corrected. "Captain Wainwright is in Bombay, drunk on gin and regret. The real work falls to those willing to dirty their hands." She leveled the pistol at Miss Marple. "Step away from the sleigh, Aunt Jane. I'd hate to ruin Raymond's Christmas with news of your untimely frostbite." Miss Marple did not move. "You forged the ledger entries in the captain's hand. Clever. But the spidery script, that's Miss Blacklock's, isn't it? The companion who is meant to inherit nothing. You've been corresponding as Lavinia Pinkerton for months, haven't you? Keeping the village gossips chasing a ghost while you emptied the manor's accounts." Mrs. Lestrange's smile thinned. "Observant. But observation won't save you. The will burns, the ledger vanishes, and by morning the ice house collapses. Tragic accident. Sleigh overturned on the mere. 2 nosy women lost to the cold. The captain inherits. Miss Blacklock is discredited, and I take my commission in peace. She reached for the hurricane lamp. Miss Marple's hand shot out, not toward the pistol, but toward the pony's reins. With a flick of her wrist, she loosed the trace chains. The animal, already frantic, reared. The sleigh lurched forward, runners screeching across the earthen floor. Mrs. Lestrange staggered, the pistol discharging into the rafters with a deafening crack. Plaster dust rained down like ash. Sims shrieked and bolted for the ladder. Miss Marple seized the moment to snatch the will and stuff it inside her coat. The pony, panicked beyond reason, plunged toward the open door, dragging the sleigh behind it. Mrs. Lestrange lunged after it, coat flapping like broken wings, but the runners caught her ankle. She fell hard, the pistol skittering across the floor. Miss Marple scooped it up. "I believe, my dear, the hunt is over." Outside, the church bell began to toll midnight, 12 measured strokes that rolled across the mere like thunder. On the final note, the ice cracked, a sound like rifle fire. The sleigh, pony, and all shot out onto Blackwater Pool just as the surface gave way. For one impossible second, the little piebald trod water, eyes rolling, before the weight of the sleigh dragged it under. Bubbles rose thick and deliberate, then ceased. Mrs. Lestrange screamed. A raw, animal sound that echoed off the pines. She scrambled to her feet, ankle twisted, and limped toward the hole. Miss Marple caught her arm. "Let it go," she said gently. "The ledger is safe beneath the blanket. The pony may yet swim, but the will," she patted her coat, "is mine." Headlights flared on the far bank. Constable Pock's ancient Austin chugged into view, Dr. Haydock at the wheel. Behind them trudged a posse of villagers armed with lanterns and righteous indignation. Mr. Puckle brandished his brass candlestick like a battle standard. Mrs. Lestrange sagged. "It was meant to be clean," she whispered. "One shot, one forged letter, one accident on the ice. The captain would never have known." "But Miss Blacklock would," Miss Marple said. "And so would the pony, poor beast. Animals remember kindness and cruelty." As Polk clapped handcuffs on the struggling woman, Miss Marple retrieved the sodden ledger from the water's edge. The ink had run, but the final entry remained legible. She folded it carefully, then turned to the solicitor, who stood shivering in his shirt sleeves. "Mr. Sims," she said, "I believe you have some explaining to do, and perhaps a new will to draft, before the real heiress arrives from Devon." The moon slipped behind a cloud. In the sudden dark, the ice house looked smaller, almost pitiful, its secrets spilled across the snow like entrails. Miss Marple accepted Dr. Haydock's arm for the walk back to the village. Behind them, the mere settled into silence, the sleigh bells lost forever beneath a lid of new ice. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked once, sharp, triumphant, gone. Chapter 4, the carol singer's deadly refrain. The village square at 7 o'clock was a living lantern, torches guttered in iron sconces along the pub wall. Paper luminarias lined the church path, their candle flames trembling behind snowflake cutouts. Children darted between legs with sparklers that hissed like angry cats. Breath rose in white plumes mingling with the scent of roasted chestnuts and the sharper tang of mulled wine. Above it all, the church tower loomed, its gargoyles wearing comical caps of snow. Miss Marple stood at the edge of the crowd, shawl drawn tight, hymnal clutched like a shield. Constable Pork had taken Mrs. Lestrange to the station in Much Benham. Mr. Sims followed under guard, blubbering about misplaced loyalties. The ledger and the true will were locked in Dr. Haydock's safe. By rights, the village should have been at ease. Instead, tension crackled louder than the torches. A second murder, they whispered, would be the killer's encore. The carol service was Mrs. Dane Calthrop's idea, a public affirmation that St. Mary's Mead would not cower. The choir, 12 adults, 6 children, and Mr. Puckle on the serpent, assembled beneath the lich gate in surplices stiff with starch. At their head stood Miss Blacklock, the companion, returned from Devon that afternoon. She wore mourning black, relieved only by a single white camellia at her throat. Her voice, when she raised it once in royal David City, was pure and steady, but her eyes scanned the crowd as though counting exits. Miss Marple watched those eyes. They lingered longest on the belfry window, a black rectangle 30 feet above the flagstones. The first carol ended to polite applause. Snowflakes drifted through the torchlight like slow-motion confetti. Mr. Clement climbed the mounting block to read the lesson. His voice carried well, too well. It masked the faint creak of rope on pulley from the tower. Miss Marple's fingers tightened on her hymnal. She had spent the afternoon in the church, ostensibly arranging poinsettias, actually mapping sightlines. The belfry stair was narrow, the door bolted from within. Yet someone had oiled the bolt. She had found shavings of beeswax on the mat. Someone else had loosened the bell rope's knot where it passed through the ceiling, 3 strands frayed to one. The second carol began, "God rest ye merry gentlemen." The choir swelled. Miss Blacklock's soprano soared above the rest, sweet and merciless. Halfway through the verse, a shadow detached itself from the belfry window, a figure in white, surplice, hood, face obscured, leaned out, arms spread like a grotesque angel. For one heartbeat, the torchlight caught the glint of steel. Miss Marple moved. She did not run. Running would have started a stampede. Instead, she glided, a small grey moth among the brighter wings, until she stood directly beneath the tower. There she opened her hymnal, tore out the title page, and folded it into a paper dart. With a flick of her wrist, she launched it upward. The dart struck the figure's hood. Startled, the assassin jerked back, and the loosened bell rope whipped free. The great tenor bell gave a single, mournful clang. The rope, suddenly weightless, snaked through the pulley and lashed downward like a whip. It caught the figure around the ankles. With a shriek that sliced the carol in half, the white-clad shape pitched headfirst from the window. Time fractured. The body turned once in the air, surplice billowing into wings. It struck the flagstones with a sound like a sack of wet cement. Silence fell, absolute. Then the screams began. Miss Marple was already kneeling. The hood had fallen back, revealing the choir mistress, Mrs. Harmon, 52, widowed, famous for her lemon drizzle and her temper. Her mouth was stuffed with holly berries, dark juice staining her lips like crude lipstick. A thin garrote of bell wire circled her throat, cutting deep enough to grate bone. But it was the fall that killed her, her neck bent at an angle no living spine could tolerate. The holly berries were the message. Miss Marple recognized the hand immediately. Mrs. Harmon had threatened to expose the forged ledger unless paid a final installment. The berries were her signature, grown in her own greenhouse, poisonous as her tongue. Chaos erupted, children wailed. Mr. Puckle dropped the serpent, which emitted a flatulent honk. Miss Blacklock stood frozen, camellia trembling at her throat. Then, slowly, she began to sing again, softly, the final verse of the ruined carol. To save us all from Satan's power when we were gone astray. Her voice drew the crowd like a lodestone. By the time Dr. Haydock pushed through, order had reasserted itself. The doctor knelt, felt for a pulse that wasn't there, and shook his head. Instantaneous, he said, but the berries, definitely deliberate. Constable Polk arrived panting, lantern swinging. Another one, and in front of the whole village, Miss Marple rose. Not in front, above. The killer used the carol as cover. Note the timing, exactly on the word power. The bell rope was sabotaged to drop at the crescendo. Mrs. Harmon was lured to the belfry with a promise of payment, garroted, then pushed. The fall was meant to look like suicide or accident. She pointed upward. The belfry window now framed a second figure. Mr. Archer, the solicitor's clerk, face chalk white. He held a coil of new rope and a look of stunned betrayal. "Archer," Park bellowed. "What in blazes?" I found her like that," the clerk stammered. "A note in my pew said to meet in the tower, something about the captain's codicil. When I got there, she was already—" He gestured helplessly at the body. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "And the holly? Did you bring that too?" Archer shook his head violently. "Never. I can't stand the stuff. Gives me a rash." A detail clicked into place. Mrs. Harmon's greenhouse had been burgled the previous night, only the holly taken. The killer had planned this finale down to the garnish. The crowd parted as Miss Blacklock approached the corpse. She knelt, touched the camellia to Mrs. Harmon's cheek, then stood. "She was going to ruin everything," she said quietly, "but not like this. Never like this." Her gaze met Miss Marple's, steady, unreadable. For a moment, the square held its breath. Then the church clock struck the quarter hour, and the spell broke. Dr. Haydock covered the body with his coat. "We'll need the tower sealed. Park, round up the choir. Someone must have seen the note pass to Archer." Miss Marple slipped away while the constable blundered into action. She had one more thread to follow. The vestry was empty. Fire banked low. On the harmonium lay a stack of music sheets, Mrs. Harmon's handwriting, the carol arrangements. Miss Marple lifted the top sheet. Beneath it, someone had penciled a new melody in the margins. A simple, haunting tune in 3/4 time. The note spelled a message in the old tonic solfa. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la. Ti, do, dreadful revelation made. Fox always lies and takes it downstairs overnight. The initials spelled Dram, Mrs. Harmon's pet name for the drama society, and downstairs meant the crypt. Miss Marple lit a candle stub and descended the narrow stairs. The crypt smelled of earth and candle smoke. Stone effigies of long-dead Pinkertons stared with blank eyes. In the far corner, a fresh scratch marred the flagstones. The outline of a fox, crudely carved. Beneath it, a loose slab. She wedged her umbrella beneath the stone and levered. It lifted with a groan. Inside lay a tin box painted with the same fox crest. She opened it. Letters, dozens, all in Mrs. Harmon's spidery hand, addressed to Captain Wainwright in Bombay. They detailed the forgery, the payments, the plan to frame Miss Blacklock. The final letter, dated yesterday, read, "If you do not pay the balance by Christmas Eve, I sing the truth from the belfry. The village will hear every note." Tucked among the letters was a photograph. Mrs. Harmon and a younger Mrs. Lestrange, arms linked at a garden party, both smiling at a fox cub on a leash. On the back, in faded ink, "To my partner in crime, L." Miss Marple closed the box. The melody in the margins had been Mrs. Harmon's insurance policy and her death warrant. Mrs. Lestrange, trapped in custody, could not have climbed the tower, but someone else had read the code, understood the threat, and silenced the singer forever. She climbed the stairs, box beneath her arm. Outside, the choir had regrouped, voices thinner now, but determined. They launched into silent night. the melody floating over the square like a benediction. Miss Marple paused on the porch, listening. In the hush between verses, she heard it, the faint, rhythmic creak of the belfry pulley still swinging though the rope was gone. Someone remained in the tower. She slipped back inside, candle raised. The stairs spiraled upward, narrow and treacherous. Halfway, she found the first clue, a single holly berry crushed underfoot, its juice staining the stone like a drop of blood. Higher, a scrap of white surplice caught on a nail. At the top, the belfry door stood ajar. Moonlight poured through the louvers, striping the floor in silver bars. The great bell hung silent, its clapper wrapped in rags to muffle sound. In the corner crouched Miss Blacklock, camellia gone, hair wild. She held the missing bell rope coiled like a noose. "I had to finish it," she whispered. She would have destroyed everything Lavinia built. The captain was weak, Mrs. Lestrange greedy. Only I understood what the estate could become, a refuge, a legacy. One more death, and the truth dies with her. Miss Marple set the tin box on the floor. "You carved the fox in the crypt. You left the melody for Archer to find, knowing he'd panic and implicate himself. You even wore Mrs. Harmon's spare surplice, kept in the vestry for emergencies, but you forgot the rash." She gestured to Miss Blacklock's wrist, red and inflamed where Holly had brushed skin. Miss Blacklock's laugh was brittle. "Details, always details with you." She lunged, rope whipping out. Miss Marple stepped aside. The coil struck the bell, producing a dull thud. The vibration travelled down the tower, a low, ominous hum. Miss Blacklock stumbled, caught herself on the railing, and the rotten wood gave way. For the second time that night, a body fell. But this time, Miss Marple was ready. She seized the rag-wrapped clapper, swung it like a pendulum. The bell caught Miss Blacklock across the shoulders, knocking her sideways into the stairwell. She tumbled, a white blur against the dark, and landed in a heap at the bottom, alive, groaning, camellia crushed beneath her. The choir's final note drifted up, pure and unbroken. Miss Marple descended, tin box in hand. At the foot of the stairs, Dr. Haydock waited, eyebrows raised. "Another accident?" he asked dryly. "Another confession," she replied, and handed him the letters. Outside, the torches had burned low. The village stood in a hush, faces upturned to the tower. Miss Marple stepped into the snow, breath pluming like incense. The case was not yet closed. There would be questions, arrests, perhaps a trial. But the melody had ended. The fox, for tonight, was caged. She joined the tail of the choir as they processed back to the vestry, their voices rising in "Hark, the herald angels sing." Somewhere in the harmony, she thought she heard Mrs. Harmon's soprano, forgiving, perhaps, or merely relieved. The snow fell softer now, stitching the square in white. Christmas Eve was only hours away, and justice, like mince pies, was best served warm. Chapter 5. Embers, Epiphany, and Ever After. The manor's library smelled of beeswax, old paper, and the ghost of cigars long banned by Joan's vegetarian regime. A single log fire crackled in the Adam grate, throwing long shadows across the turkey carpet and the assembled suspects, who looked as though they had been arranged by a particularly morbid taxidermist. Miss Marple sat in the high-winged chair that had once belonged to Lavinia Pinkerton herself, her cocoa cup balanced on one knee, her knitting in her lap. The needles moved in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Plain, pearl, plain, like the ticking of a clock no one else could hear. Constable Park stood by the door, helmet under one arm, handcuffs glinting in the firelight. Dr. Haydock leaned against the mantel, pipe unlit, out of respect for the cocoa. Mr. Clement had taken the piano stool, turning it to face the room as though preparing to accompany a requiem. Miss Blacklock, ankle bandaged, wrists raw from holly rash, sat on the chaise longue, flanked by the solicitor Sims and the clerk Archer, both pale as parchment. Mrs. Lestrange, still in custody but granted a final audience for clarity, occupied the window seat, wrists cuffed but posture regal, the verbena scent of her perfume cutting through the wood smoke like a dare. Outside, the snow had ceased. The world lay hushed under a crust of diamond frost, the church spire a black needle against a sky rinsed clean. Inside, the only movement was the fire and Miss Marple's needles. She began without preamble, voice soft as falling ash. 3 deaths were planned, only 2 were delivered. The third, Mrs. Harmon's, was an improvisation born of panic. But every improvisation leaves a seam, and seams can be unpicked. She lifted the green ledger from the table beside her. Its pages fluttered like wounded birds. Exhibit 1. The ledger. Mrs. Lestrange forged Captain Wainwright's hand to show payments to a fictitious blackmailer. Miss Blacklock added the spidery marginalia to create the illusion of Lavinia Pinkerton still alive, directing affairs from beyond the grave. Their goal was simple: keep the estate in limbo until the captain returned to claim it, by which time the funds would be safely laundered through Swiss accounts. Mrs. Harmon discovered the forgery and demanded a larger share. She was promised payment in the belfry. Instead, she received a garrote and a 30-foot drop. Miss Blacklock's breath hitched. "I never meant—" "You meant to silence her," Miss Marple interrupted gently. "You wore her spare surplice, left the coded melody for Archer to find, knowing he would panic and draw attention upward while you escaped down the crypt stair. But you forgot the holly rash. Details, my dear, are the conscience of crime." She set the ledger aside and lifted the tin box from the crypt. Exhibit 2, the letters. Mrs. Harmon's insurance policy. She photographed herself with Mrs. Lestrange years ago. Garden party. Fox cub on a leash. A memento, she thought. A noose, in the end. When Mrs. Lestrange realized the letters existed, she arranged the postman's death to retrieve them. The violet envelope was bait, the yew tree pulley her stage trick. But Mr. Bunting was innocent, merely the messenger. His murder was the first domino. Mrs. Lestrange's cuffs clinked as she leaned forward. "And the icicle? The sleigh?" "My flourishes, yes. But the pony drowned. That was never part of the plan." "Nor was the scarf," Miss Marple said. "You tore it to plant in the icicle, then darned the pieces together in the ice house to retrieve later. A mistake. Darning thread is coarser than Royal Mail wool," Mrs. Price noticed when she served tea. Sims whimpered. "I only notarized the forged codicil. I swear, I didn't know." "You knew enough to melt the collection plate to destroy the wax seal impressions," Miss Marple said, "and to hide the captain's signet ring in the vestry stove. But fire leaves traces. The gold melted into the shape of a fox. Your family crest, Mr. Sims. Careless." Archer burst into tears. "I passed the note to Mrs. Harmon. I thought it was about the Drama Society's accounts. She was treasurer, I was secretary." "You were the perfect dupe," Miss Marple agreed. "Mrs. Harmon used you to lure Miss Blacklock to the belfry, planning a double murder framed as murder-suicide. Miss Blacklock turned the tables. The bell rope was her improvisation. Cut 3 strands, leave 1. Physics did the rest." She laid the knitting aside. Half a mitten, the cuff patterned with tiny foxes chasing their tails, and lifted a final object. The Queen of Spades from the tea-room table, its face scratched out. Exhibit 3. The card, Mrs. Lestrange's calling card, left to taunt. But the hatpin scratch marks matched the one found in Mrs. Harmon's sewing basket. She stole it from the tea room earlier, planning to plant it on Miss Blacklock, another seam. The fire popped. A coal shifted, sending up a shower of sparks. Miss Marple sipped her cocoa. The motive was greed, yes, but also fear. Lavinia Pinkerton's true will left the estate to a sanctuary for retired donkeys. The captain would have sold to developers. Mrs. Lestrange wanted the money. Miss Blacklock wanted the dream. Mrs. Harmon wanted both. Mr. Bunting was simply in the way. She turned to Miss Blacklock. You sang the final verse of the carol to cover the sound of the pulley, but you sang it in Lavinia's key, E-flat major. Mrs. Harmon always transposed to D. The choir noticed. Another seam. Miss Blacklock's shoulders sagged. I only wanted to protect what Lavinia loved. You protected it with blood, Miss Marple said, and nearly orphaned 4 children in the process. Silence pooled, thick as the cocoa dregs. Outside, the church clock struck 9, 3 clear chimes that seemed to echo inside the room. Constable Pork cleared his throat. So, Mrs. Lestrange for the postman, Miss Blacklock for Mrs. Harmon, and Sims and Archer as accessories. Precisely, Miss Marple said, though the captain will face charges in absentia when he sobers up in Bombay. The donkeys, I suspect, will have their sanctuary after all. Dr. Haydock knocked out his unlit pipe. And the pony. Swam to the far bank, Miss Marple said. Mr. Puckle found it at dawn, eating holly from Mrs. Harmon's greenhouse. Animals, as I said, remember kindness. Mrs. Lestrange laughed, a low, bitter sound. Checkmate, Aunt Jane. Miss Marple inclined her head. Stalemate, perhaps. You all moved the pieces, but the board was never yours. She rose, folding the mitten neatly. Constable, if you would be so kind. The snow has stopped. The roads will be passable by morning. I believe Scotland Yard will wish to speak to our guests before the Christmas post. Palk snapped to attention. The handcuffs clinked as Mrs. Lestrange and Miss Blacklock were led away. Sims followed, sniffling. Archer required Dr. Haydock's arm to keep him upright. The library emptied until only Miss Marple and Mr. Clement remained. The vicar closed the piano lid with a soft thud. Will you stay for the midnight service? He asked. She considered the fire, the cocoa, the quiet. I think not. My nephew's vegetarian shepherd's pie awaits, and I have a train to catch at dawn. But I will leave you the mitten. The donkeys will need warmth. He took it, bemused. You knit justice into every stitch. Only the pattern, she said. The yarn is human nature. She donned her coat, grey wool, sensible buttons, and stepped into the hall. The grandfather clock showed 10 minutes to 10. Outside, the village lay silvered and still, footprints already softening under new snow. The church windows glowed amber, promising carols and candlelight and the brief, fragile peace that follows truth. Miss Marple paused on the doorstep. From the police van came the muffled sound of Mrs. Lestrange humming, off-key, defiant, the first bars of Greensleeves, the same tune Mr. Bunting had whistled on his final round. Miss Marple smiled, small and sad, and closed the door. By morning the manor would be shuttered, the donkeys en route from Devon, the village gossiping over teacups about the Christmas murders that weren't quite murders after all. Miss Marple would be on the 9:17 to London, knitting a matching mitten, the pattern complete. The snow fell again, soft as forgiveness, covering blood and bullet casings and the last faint hoofprints of a pony that had chosen life. St. Mary's Mead slept, the case closed, the foxes, both real and metaphorical, put to bed, And somewhere in the hush between snowflakes, justice cast off its final stitch.